You told me how to make my screen black. Oh, here it is. Black is really a good color for what I'm going to talk about today because it's about the newspaper business. And I'm pretty sure that the reason I was invited was to make you feel better about things that are happening in your lives. So I'm actually here representing the, I'm an adjunct professor in the Department of Schadenfreude at UC-Berkeley. No, actually, I'm not a professor. I'm just a lowly hired hand who helps out in the journalism school. So I've been asked to talk about what happened in newspapers, and at first I thought, well, you know, I'm happy to do that, but I have no idea how this could possibly relate to the challenges you're getting, because I do, even though I'm only a lowly member of the adjunct faculty of the lowly journalism school at Berkeley, I do get these memos, these tortured memos from the vice chancellor, who he always sends them out like about 9 o'clock on Friday night, talking about the latest cuts and so forth. I don't know, maybe the idea is maybe nobody will notice, or he wants everybody else to have a bad weekend too. But at any rate, it's quite awful in California, and it's quite awful for UC. And so I thought, well, how could this possibly, you know, what's going on with newspapers matter to you? And I think the reason it does is because the newspaper business was so incredibly terrific for so many years that nobody ever thought anything could go wrong. And that's how the newspaper industry went wrong, because the newspaper industry didn't see change coming. And really, honestly, I hang out with a lot of newspaper publishers. I just hang out in bad company, this group accepted. But they still don't really, truly, deeply inside know how much things have changed. This is newspaper print advertising sales way back to 1969. You can see that this is about as perfect of a it's about as perfect of an uptick as you could possibly have until things hit the wall here in 2005. This little orange thing, if you can see it, is their internet revenues. The newspaper industry didn't actually start counting internet advertising revenues until 2003, well after most of the rest of us had gotten the memo. That'll show you how really recalcitrant they are. Well, what happened to the newspaper business? This great arc suddenly was disrupted by, you guessed it, the internet. And that's a picture of ARPANET circa 1969, for those of you who can't read it. I think that's actually in Al Gore's handwriting, which proves that, in fact, he was the inventor of the internet. And what happened is that for 10 years after the internet got invented, let's just say from 1995 to 2005, everything still remained hunky and dory for the newspaper business. The newspaper business actually survived the twin cataclysms of the tech crunch in late 2000, and then, of course, the awfulness of 9/11. And they really rebuilt and rebounded. In the year 2005, newspapers had their all-time high advertising sales of $49.4 billion. But what happened is that this whole internet thing kept creeping up on them. And when I found in my research, both here in the US as well as around the world, that when you got to about 20% penetration of broadband internet, high-speed internet, DSL, cable, it really began to deteriorate both revenues and, both circulation and advertising sales, because that was the tipping point. So change comes after the disruptive event, and the tipping point comes later than you think. So you may think that you've dodged the bullet, or in this case, it was more like a machine gun fire in a RPG, but they did not dodge the bullet at all, but they thought they had, which affected their thinking. So newspapers today are in a great crisis, and really, in a minute, I'll tell you, it's more than just about newspapers. We've had some 30,000 people lost their newspaper jobs. That's not a lot when you compare it to, General Motors, but it's a lot for the newspaper business, probably around 10 or 12%. The Detroit newspapers don't deliver newspapers at home 7 days a week anymore. Newspapers have shut in Denver and Seattle and other markets. 8 newspaper publishers, as of the last time I checked, and I just checked before I came down here, have filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, including the Tribune Company, which filed for bankruptcy less than 12 months after it was bought by that crazy, zany guy, Sam Zell. Several of the publishers have been booted off the New York Stock Exchange because their share prices are too low. Newshold, the amount of newsprint that goes through news, has shrunken, as you can tell by hefting your paper. Advertising, obviously, has shrunken as well, further contracting the newspapers. Newspapers have been shuttering bureaus. Fewer than half fewer than half the states in this country have a Washington correspondent in D.C. here. In other words, half those states, there's nobody from any newspaper in D.C. actually covering them. I think the Al Jazeera Washington bureau is bigger than most of the Washington bureaus of any but, say, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal. Morale is shattered at newspapers, and that hurts. Newspaper circulation is now half of what it was in 1946, which is even before I was born, and even though you probably think I was born by then. And it now only represents 18% of the population versus 36% of the population. So the blue lines have to do with newspaper circulation. The orange one has to do with population growth. Young people increasingly are not reading newspapers, and I think this is profoundly important, speaking as somebody who is engaging with students in the classroom, albeit a small number. But I teach journalism students, and I said to them, I did a blind poll when I began the class, how much time do you spend per day reading the print newspaper? And about 2/3 of them said none, not at all, zero, zilch, nada, not at all. And they're journalism students. They don't. So what this is, the younger you are, the less likely you are to read a newspaper, and the trend is going from upper left to lower right, and that's not a good thing. As I said before, ad sales now are down nearly $12 billion from the peak in 2005 as of the end of 2008. And this is the most shocking and chilling slide. This shows the quarterly drop in newspaper print advertising sales since the beginning of 2006. And as you can see, it's been down every month, and save for 1 month when it wasn't down as much as it was the others, it's dropping at an accelerated rate. And as of right now, there is no bottom in sight. Newspaper profits have been shrunken enormously, forcing these cutbacks that I just described a minute ago, and cutting into the kind of coverage that we have. It's getting ever harder for some newspaper companies to make enough money to sustain the large infrastructure that's necessary, the presses, the trucks, the people. Debt for the industry is out of control for two reasons. One, they went out and borrowed a lot of money back in the good old days of 05, 06, 07, when money was plentiful and credit was, anybody could fog a mirror and buy get a few $1 billion. And so that's one of the reasons why this blue line of debt is going up. The other is that the relationship between debt and cash is widening, because this is the line that shows how much cash they have to repay the debt. This is widening because they are generating less profits, as I described a minute ago. And what happens when you can't make ends meet is the newspaper is in the garbage can, and that one was shut recently, the Tucson Citizen. It's not just newspapers. The news weeklies are falling apart. Newsweek has cut its rate base, the number of copies it aims to sell, from 3 million in 2007 to 1.5 million this year. U.S. News has stopped being a weekly. Newsweek may stop being a weekly. I don't know what they'll change the name to. News semi-weekly, news bi-weekly. Broadcast news is falling apart. ABC News has outsourced its coverage in Iraq to the BBC. NPR, which is privately funded. Everybody says, well, private funding will help newspapers. Like, not, because you still have to make ends meet in the business. NPR has cut its staff by 7%. In San Francisco, the local affiliate has cut its staff by 14%. What happened? Everything changed. We went from the world of mass media, where the big blue dot represents newspapers and television, to a much more fragmented media world, and that's the world we're living in today. So just so you can see here, orange are the consumers, green are the advertisers, dark blue are the mainstream media companies, radio, TV, newspapers, magazine. Light blue are new media enterprises. And as you can see, the relationships are very much more fragmented here in the world we live in today than in the world where we lived before. And this profoundly affects consumer behavior and advertiser behavior. So consumers can make their own media, consumers can get media from non-traditional sources. You can give and get. There's this complete yin and yang of what's going on with the media. The new world that we live in today in the media business, and this applies well beyond newspapers, and arguably in some ways it is going to apply to you as well in higher education, and we need to think about that, and I hope that at least I'll contribute that strain of thinking here. I know it's straining me to think. So. But we're going from a time when infrastructure was intensive and controlled by a few. Lord Thompson said the power of a press, the press was a license to print money. the power of the press belongs to the man who owns one, and it was always men, almost always, except for the one across the street. Now, of course, media is mobile and light. It used to be that media was latent. This guy up here sitting on a stool writing up the news of the sinking of the Titanic in really great penmanship. And when he actually had a wheeled stool, when he got to the end, he would wheel back and start writing again, as opposed to news that finds you today wherever you are, for example, on your 3G iPhone. It used to be that you had to plan to be someplace to get the information, to tune in for a TV show or a radio show. Now today, of course, you can time shift what you're getting, when you get it, how you get it, where you get it on the platform you're getting it. And you can mix and match, and you can remix it if you don't like it. If you don't like the show, you don't like the tune, you can remix it. It used to be that content was institutionally produced. Now it's user-generated. This is a snapshot from the Coke and Diet Mentos videos. How many of you have seen that? That's pretty cool. You're pretty cool people. All right. What it is, if you put a Mentos into a Diet Coke, it has an explosive reaction, and I'm sure the chemists here will explain that. All I can tell you is these two guys, they made a series of these videos, and they eventually got sponsored by, guess who? Coke and Diet Mentos. It used to be that media was one size fits all, in part because that was the only way it worked. Now, of course, the San Francisco Chronicle is dwarfed by this, and millions of other places people can go to spend their time. It used to be that media were lean back. I would lean back to read the paper, lean back to watch TV. Now it's lean forward. The consumer is in control. And what you have then, therefore, is you have a complete change in how people consume news, advertising, and, I would argue, information, the kind of information y'all spew out there in the university like me. In the olden days, content was considered by consumers to be knowledge. Now it's really entertainment. Young people today don't really make a distinction between news, information, advertising, entertainment. If it's interesting, they'll watch. Northwestern University has done a lot of research on this. If it's interesting, they'll watch it. If they don't like it, they'll move on. It used to be that the consumption of content was cool and passive. Now it's hot and it's active. Young people today don't just simply read or download music or watch videos. They make their own. They comment. They are totally interactive. They are not passive consumers of anything. The minute they get bored, they move on. We used to have a day when you were disciplined critical readers, and if those of you who are still in the classroom, you know how hard it is to get students to actually, dare I say the word, think. They want to know what's on the test, how do I get my grade, what are the blah, 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 blah. They're all like filling in blanks. They're processing. They're like working in a sausage plant. And they don't think. This is very upsetting to me. And so, of course, I won't give them the answers to any of those questions. I just say you just have to think about it. The older reader used technology only when necessary. The young reader, the modern reader, embraces technology. Something new comes out, they want to know how it works, how to use it, how to make it to their advantage, how they can hack it, how they can do something new with it. That's why we have so many iPhone applications, because it's easy to develop on that platform. It's easy to develop on that platform, and you can express yourself. And that's really the other thing, is that this media today is not simply a way of getting information. It's a way of expressing yourself. It's a way of being part of a group. It's a completely different experience than the passive lean-back experience I mentioned a minute ago. The old media consumer favored structure and a degree of predictability. You kind of knew what was going to be in the Washington Post in the morning. You expected different stories every day. You got them every day, but you kind of knew the kind of stuff you'd get there. Today, people embrace serendipity, and a weird video about a water skiing squirrel will trump something out of Iraq any day of the week. In the olden days, when I was a lad, people valued professionally produced content. Today, early research shows that young people prefer peer-generated content. They believe a review in Yelp more than they will believe a review in Gourmet Magazine or the San Francisco Chronicle. Getting a piece of information from somebody else telling them this is cool, you should see this, is much more important than something that's stripped across a banner in the New York Times or that leads the ABC News. This is a huge thing for you to think about. In the olden days, we had relatively long attention spans, in part because we just didn't have that much information we had to deal with. Today, you wake up in the morning, you've got emails, you've got your chats, you've got your Facebook. My gosh, my friend, in my Facebook account just got a zit. There's a lot of stuff going on in the world you have to be keeping track of. And so you're so busy just trying to feel like you're in touch to gather and process and then be in touch outbound, that you don't have time to go deep on anything. And if you have students, you know that they don't go deep on anything unless you really make it. And that's why you have, like, why do we have to have quiz for grown-ups in college to see if they read the stuff, to make sure that they read the stuff? Because they won't do it intrinsically. That's awful. Some of them, of course, do, but lots of them don't. In short, we used to have very loyal audiences, and you could reasonably predict what they were going to do from time to time. And advertisers like that, it was good for business. It was good for everybody. It was even good for our culture, our society. Today, nobody's faithful to anything. You've seen that MySpace last week dumped 30% of its staff because MySpace isn't making it. MySpace is old. It's over. It's done for. Facebook may or may not make it. If you want a side bet with me, I say it doesn't. Some people say Twitter will. Anyway, the long and short of it is the newspaper industry failed to understand the difference between the traditional consumer, the new consumer, what advertisers would want in the future versus what advertisers bought in the past. They simply didn't get it. They didn't think about it. They didn't challenge any of the assumptions. That's where we interconnect from the newspaper problem to where you all are today. You have to understand that everything is changing. It has changed. You can't stop it. You cannot go back. I don't know what the solutions are, but I can tell you that the change is real. It's happening. It's upon us. And it's culturally happened for people, say, under the age of 30, who, incidentally, are your consumers for the most part. Newspapers failed to respond because they believed that they had a superior product, and it blinded them to the possibility that maybe everybody wouldn't think it was superior forever. Their history looking backward said growth was inevitable. We always had growth. Why wouldn't we have growth in the future? You could just project out the business doing one of these, or actually one of these, since you're on that side of the screen here. They didn't heed the market forces, and they didn't understand that a slow migration wasn't the same as no migration. Papers tinkered, and still do, amazingly. They tinker tactically. They fix things. I cannot tell you how many, I can't tell you how many newspapers say, well, let's add more color. Let's redesign the paper. Let's change our slogan. Let's change our masthead. I mean, dudes, come on. You know, this is serious. This is not simply a tinker thing. So don't think that just because you're busy tinkering tactically, which is not easy to say this early in the morning, don't think that that's going to work. You need to get outside of the box. The newspaper guys, unfortunately, are so busy trying to duct tape the box back together again that they can't get outside the box. And that's where they went wrong. Their competitors got a spectacular head start. I think you know who they are and where they live. So why does this matter to educators? Simple. Many of the consumers I just talked about are your consumers too. Most of them are. And that's why it matters.